So it looks like the United States is going to war. I mean, as the timeless meme says, born just in time to deploy to the Middle East. Now, this isn't just a matter of pretty significant statements coming from U.S. President Trump in the last 12 hours, but also actions. We're seeing a significant number of U.S. military assets relocate to the Middle East. But starting out with some of those Trump statements that caught quite a few people off guard last night, he started out by saying, Iran should have signed the deal I told them to sign. What a shame and a waste of human life. Simply stated, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I said it over and over again. Everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. And that caused some chaos across Iran, around the world, for what it's worth, right? That's a pretty significant warning coming from the most powerful military in the world. But he didn't stop there. President Trump continued really hammering on this point of Iran, their capabilities around nuclear weapons, and the possibility of U.S. intervention. He said, quote, America first means many great things, including the fact that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Make America great again. Now, that largely was aimed at a lot of detractors inside of his camp, saying, in the isolationist wing, essentially saying, how on earth is what's happening between Israel and Iran relevant to the United States? How is this America first? And there you have it. President Trump addressing it, saying, it is America first, basically because I said it's America first, to not parse that out too awful far. A big piece here as well is that the president left immediately, unexpectedly, from the G7 summit being held in Canada. The rumor there that originally circulated was that this was to go back to D.C. to work on a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. But Trump pushed back on this, saying, wrong. Macron has no idea why I'm on my way back to Washington, but it has nothing to do with a ceasefire. It's much bigger than that. And then a shot at Macron saying he's always wrong, but stay tuned. Now, it was at this time we got notification that President Trump reported across a couple different outlets, asked that his National Security Council be available in the Situation Room upon his return to Washington, D.C., of course, prompting the idea that last night may have begun U.S. military strikes against Iran. Now, I want to stress there are still no indications, despite some various reporting in a couple different outlets, that U.S. military assets have been used in any capacity against Iran so far. That does not appear to have happened at all. But President Trump seems to really be making the case for this to happen in the near future. I mean, they put out a post on their rapid response account. So this is an official account coming from the White House where they said President Trump has never wavered in his stance that Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. A pledge he has made repeatedly, both in office and on the campaign trail. And I'm not going to play all these clips. Maybe we'll scroll through it real quick, but dozens maybe of examples of President Trump hammering that exact point. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Look, personal opinion, to me, this type of messaging really seems like the case is being made for military intervention against Iran, or at the very least, against the Iranian nuclear program. Now, we talked in a recent video about the reasons why the United States may get involved, kind of the rationale, not necessarily justification, but the rationale for U.S. involvement. The first and most obvious example here is the U.S. going after the Fordo nuclear facility. And the bottom line there is this facility has centrifuges buried up to 300 feet below the surface, built into the side of a mountain, heavily fortified, not just in terms of air defense assets around it, but also just the ability to actually inflict enough damage to really destroy or significantly degrade that nuclear capability. It's not generally believed that Israel has the capabilities to do that quickly. There's some larger ordnance that the United States has in our arsenal that would likely be able to have a greater impact in a shorter time frame. That's one of the arguments being made here, is that if the goal, not just of Israel, as they have stated, but as President Trump is stating right now, that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon, it's believed that a good portion of that program is in Fordo. The United States has the ability to destroy that relatively quickly. That's one of the arguments for U.S. involvement. The other piece here, kind of playing in President Trump's favor, or in the favor of anybody arguing for U.S. intervention, is we have seen in recent days Israel achieve air superiority over western and portions of central Iran, and definitely over the capital of Tehran. Now, air superiority does not mean that there are no threats to aircraft overhead. Air supremacy or air dominance is largely what we experienced in the United States throughout the war in Afghanistan, where our fixed-wing aircraft were under really zero threat from surface-to-air launch munitions or air-to-air munitions. Of course, that didn't exist in Afghanistan. That's not quite what's happening over Iran as of yet. We do have footage of Israeli drones loitering over Tehran, which is crazy to see just 3 or 4 days into this operation. But we also have no indication that any Israeli aircraft have even been hit, let alone crashed or been down inside of Iran. Despite yesterday, Iran, of course, saying they downed the 4th Israeli F-35. Zero evidence to back that up, except for this wild image of like an aircraft carrier-sized F-35. Clearly AI. Nonetheless, if President Trump is trying to decide if we're going to go into Iran and carry out this attack, I think it's safe to argue right now that it is the least amount of threat to U.S. aircraft that has existed over Iran probably in my lifetime, certainly since the advent of the Iranian nuclear program roughly 20 years ago. So there are likely people in his camp pushing in that direction. Now, we're not just looking at statements made from the president and his key advisors in recent days. As I mentioned, we have started to see the actual movement of U.S. military assets to the region. Now, to be fair, this could all be argued as a negotiating tactic to try to pressure Iran to come back to the negotiating table with lesser asks, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But just yesterday, we got confirmation that the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group is on its way to the Middle East from the South China Sea. That was originally reported by Fox News. They say the Nimitz was previously scheduled to replace the USS Carl Vinson Carrier Strike Group, which has been deployed for several months in the Middle East, but they're heading over there ahead of schedule. So that means that we're going to end pulling up a graphic here from Ian Ellis over on X, who does just an incredible job tracking U.S. naval resources around the world. 2 carrier strike groups in the Middle East. For the second time in the last few months, if you'll remember when the campaign against the Houthis was really picking up, we saw actually the Carl Vinson was the second carrier strike group that moved into that region. And we had 2 there for a short period of time before, I think it was the Eisenhower came back home. And, or no, Truman. Was it the Truman came back home? Either way, carrier strike group came back home. Now we're back up to 2 in that region. That's a lot of firepower, and it's generally viewed as being directed at Iran. Additionally, yesterday, and this has been nonstop, there's been at least 30 U.S. refueling aircraft moved into the region. We have a ton of these, so that's not even a significant portion of our fleet. More what it does is signify that they might be needed for something. You don't just fly refuelers all around the world for fun. They don't need to do that for their exercise, for to maintain proficiency. We've seen, I think yesterday morning it was 32, and at least another half dozen or a dozen more moved overseas last night into generally the European area. And this followed the Secretary of State, or the Secretary of Defense statement, Secretary Hegseth, talking about the reallocation of American resources to the Middle East. Now, in his statement here, you'll see that he is adamant that this is all being done in a manner of defense, the goal of protecting American forces in the region, because we do have a fair number of U.S. troops based all throughout the Middle East. And as of now, that is generally how this is being portrayed. But again, refueling aircraft don't really do a whole lot when it comes to the protection of troops on the ground. At that point, you're really talking about assisting aircraft in long-range strikes. So whether that's Israeli aircraft trying to hit certain targets inside of Iran, allowing them to be airborne for longer periods of time, or U.S. aircraft taking off from bases in the region, there's a lot of movement in the direction of possible military action here in the coming days. Now, I mentioned the ceasefire proposal here, and this came out yesterday where this one being reported in the Times of Israel, that Iran is kind of waving the flag, saying, enough, we're actually ready to talk. I don't personally think that's actually in the cards. So they say these comments followed earlier reports on Monday that Iran has been signaling through other Arab states that it wants to end its conflict with Israel and return to the negotiating table. Tehran is reportedly seeking a ceasefire as a condition for re-engaging in diplomacy, while Gulf states urge Washington to help de-escalate the crisis. Personal opinion, I don't think that's in the cards at all. When you are the United States and Israel, in this case, looking at an Iranian regime that is weaker than it's ever been, that has been threatening violence and carrying out violence against Israel and the United States for decades now, it's very hard to look at that scenario with their air defense assets completely destroyed in a good portion of the country, senior leadership being eliminated left and right, and say, cool, now that's enough. We'll go back and talk. It just, by all accounts, the United States and Israel, really Israel right now, has the upper hand in this situation. So it's hard to see the incentive for the United States saying, cool, we're ready to talk at this point. You also have to consider, what would Iran have to give up for the U.S. to actually agree to a ceasefire and getting Israel to stop, if we even could, and returning to talks. Now, another important aspect here when looking at why the United States might get involved is brought up around the quantity of missiles to missile interceptors between these two nations. So Jennifer Griffin over on Fox News reported yesterday, she said Israeli officials say Iran has fired 370 ballistic missiles at Israel. When this conflict started, I was told by well-placed sources that Iran has between 750 and 1,000 ballistic missiles capable of hitting Israel. That would suggest that Iran has expended nearly half or one-third of its ballistic missile stockpile. And an important aspect there is we know that Iran has a lot of underground missile storage facilities. That is a pretty precise number, 750 to 1,000, not missiles overall, but missiles capable of hitting Israel, which is a pretty long distance, right? Take that with a huge grain of salt, right? It is Iran's goal has always been to, any military, has been to mask your military capabilities. So, is it 750 to 1,000? Is it lower? Is it higher? It's broad guesses is the safe way to look at that. In the same light, shifting over to the interceptor conversation here, Dan Caldwell, who was a former Pentagon staffer, he was actually involved in a senior advisor at the Pentagon up until just a couple weeks ago. He was actually one of those guys that got pushed out by Secretary Hegseth in those claimed leak stuff. It's been a wild story there, but to avoid the domestic side, Dan Caldwell put out an interesting statement here talking about the lack of interceptors that Israel has. He said, most estimates I've seen put the number of Iranian missiles capable of hitting Israel closer to 2,000. But even if you accept these lower-end estimates, the 750 to 1,000, a few things to keep in mind. Iran still likely possesses thousands of drones that can reach Israel and thousands of shorter-range missiles that can target U.S. bases and other countries in the region. In addition, Iran still possesses cruise missiles that, as far as I can tell, haven't been used yet. A couple notes there. He's correct. I've not seen any indications of Iranian cruise missiles used quite yet. There are a lot of targets in the Middle East that are not just Israel. We've talked in recent days about the U.S. bases at risk of coming under fire, and there's a lot of those that are a lot closer to Iran than Israel. The drone threat is interesting, and we're going to come back to this here in a second, but those drones, by and large, have been pretty effectively shot down by Israel. They're slow moving. You can pick them up a long ways away. They're not super maneuverable, and we're seeing pretty cheap assets like helicopters down a lot of these drones. That said, they can still take up a lot of space and chew through interceptors or just, if nothing else, exhaust the defender, right? If you've got constant waves of these drones, it's keeping people awake. It's keeping people on edge for long periods of time. That does actually play a role here as well. But continuing on with Caldwell, he says, as the war continues, Iran will learn more about the weaknesses of the Israeli missile defense system, which will enable their barrages to become more effective. I think the reason why last night's barrages seemed more effective from the first few days was because the Iranians incorporated the lessons they learned from the first 48 hours of the war. You've seen the Russians and Ukrainians do this very effectively. Yes and no. I'm going to kind of agree and disagree there. We have to assume that Iran is learning as they go. A challenge that they have is the loss of leadership inside of the Iranian regime. So that's definitely going to play a component into their ability to adapt on the fly, you would think. Another piece here is that there's a bias in what we see and what we're able to report on. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday with Joe Truzman during an interview on this channel. I'll link it in the description below. Most of that was talking about the Iranian proxy threat, but we did get into some of the Iranian targeting here. And the issue with kind of understanding what they're targeting and how is we're limited to what gets through. And that doesn't tell the entire story, right? So maybe a softer target allows more munitions through. There's not as many air defense assets around a certain location. Does that mean that Iran is targeting that more, or just that they have a higher success rate at that location, right? For all we know, 98% of the Iranian missiles may have been aimed at Israeli air bases, and the reason they're all getting intercepted is because those are very hardened targets and have a lot of air defense assets around them. So we are kind of picking in the dark when it comes to assessing the Iranian targeting. Now, Caldwell also hit on the overall number of interceptors, saying the United States only produces around 100 to 150 THAAD interceptors a year and similar numbers of SM-3 and 6s. During the fight against the Houthis in 2024, the U.S. expended a year's worth of SM-3 production in a single day. I will assume Israel has stockpiled a decent number of arrows and stunners for its David slings, but they've had to expend many of those against the Houthis and during Iran's previous missile attacks last year. It is therefore likely that Israel and the United States are going to have to start rationing their interceptors, if they haven't already, further increasing the effectiveness of even smaller Iranian barrages. Bottom line, even if this smaller estimate of Iranian ballistic missiles can reach Israel is accurate, Iran can still inflict a lot of damage on Israel, U.S. bases, and other countries in the region. A couple key components there. That last part is very, very important to stress. Iran still has a lot of capabilities to inflict a lot of damage, not just on Israel, but on U.S. military bases and our allies throughout the region. So even as we see the total number of Iranian missiles decreasing that are being fired, decreasing day by day, we're going to get into the effectiveness of some of the Israeli strikes as well. This is far from over, and Iran does still have a significant strike capability. The key aspect, I think, that Caldwell is hitting at there is well known to anybody following war and conflict. Missile interceptors cost a lot more money and are a lot harder to produce than missiles. It's just the bottom line. There's no two ways about it. We're getting better at finding cheap ways to shoot down drones because those drones are so incredibly cheap, especially the Shaheds. But when it comes to missiles, the interceptors are still really expensive. And we have started, and that's not anything new. We've known that for a while. It's an issue that we're looking around the world and seeing countries like Iran and Russia develop these low-cost, long-range munitions. It's concerning because we haven't come up with an adequate defense response to that quite yet. In this particular case, we have started to see Israel use more and more alternative means to down some of these drones. Namely, just in the last couple days, we're actually seeing helicopters be utilized. We've got the view from the helicopter cockpit identifying and engaging some of these Shahed drones. When you're talking about a cheap interceptor, 30 millimeter cannon or something inside of an Apache is pretty cheap to shoot down a drone. Now, turning over to the Israeli and Iranian actions here in the last 24 hours, IDF spokesperson put out a statement saying, quote, "Our aim is to remove the threat and target Iran's nuclear program and missile infrastructure." So they continue to hammer the mission of this operation day in and day out. That has been unchanged. He says, throughout the day, Israeli Air Force identified several trucks carrying weapons and surface-to-air missile launchers. The trucks attempted to evade IDF strikes, but were struck from the air, thereby preventing further launches towards the state of Israel. We have quite a bit of footage of those. And then he says, this evening, a remotely piloted aircraft flew over the Tehran International Airport and struck 2 Iranian F-14 fighter jets. This represents another loss of strategic weaponry for the enemy. I think a lot of folks are, a little bit sad to see those go, see the F-14s go. They probably were not operational at this point, but nonetheless, similar to what we saw in Syria, that Israel was carrying out strikes there, you don't want to risk that coming into circulation when you have the ability to take out fighter jets on the tarmac. Even if they are disabled and not operational, you go ahead and take that shot. They additionally were able to eliminate the most senior Iranian military commander who just took over 4 days ago. So short lifespan for these Iranian leaders these days. They say last night they eliminated Ali Shadami, the most senior military commander of the Iranian regime. Shadami served as the wartime chief of staff for the Iranian regime's armed forces and was the closest associate of Iran's supreme leader. He was appointed to replace the previous chief of staff, who was neutralized in the opening strike of the operation. He was only in the role for 4 days when he too was eliminated. This has to be incredibly concerning for Iranian leadership. So when you look at that opening wave of strikes, you can back off and say maybe Israel had been conducting surveillance on some of these senior leaders for weeks, months, likely years, especially like the nuclear scientists, right? They knew exactly where they would be and when. They knew which window was theirs in an apartment building, the window that went into their bedroom. They knew where the military officers were going to be if they weren't at home, and real-time intelligence to be able to carry out those strikes. You can understand that, and from Iran's perspective, it's kind of an oh shit moment because it means that Israel has eyes on everything. But there's a point once this operation begins, you can vary your movements, and all of a sudden, what's to say that this Shadmani guy had the same amount of surveillance dedicated to him? Probably not as much as some of these other commanders. So what his elimination means this shortly after his appointment is that Israel was able to pick him up, identify him, and track him during the course of this offensive operation. That should be concerning for Iranian leadership because it means that they are not safe moving around inside their own country right now. Now, there's a pretty interesting strike yesterday that we actually have caught on camera. IDF hit a news station in Iran. So yesterday, the IDF Arabic language spokesperson put out a note in Persian saying, "Dear citizens of Iran, for your safety, we ask you to immediately leave the mentioned area in District 3. In the coming hours, the Israeli army will operate in this area, as it has in recent days, throughout Tehran to strike the Iranian regime's military infrastructure. In a vague warning after that, we saw the defense minister, Katz, say, quote, "The Iranian propaganda and incitement mouthpiece is on its way to disappear." And shortly after that statement, we got this clip. Let's give it a watch.
صدای متجاوز به خاک وطن، صدای متجاوز به صدای حق و حقیقت است. آنچه که ملاحظه کردید، صدایی که شنیدید، فضای غبارآلود استادیوم.
And the IDF confirmed that they carried out this strike against an Iranian state news network in a statement saying, quote, "This center was used by the armed forces to advance military operations under civilian control using its own means and assets." Something to think about here is we are, again, 4 days into this operation, and Israel called their shot. So they announced, not the specific building, although you don't have to really read between the lines with what the defense minister said there. At the very least, they said, we are going to carry out a strike in this small portion of Tehran. Evacuate now. And Iran was not able to stop them. Again, I think this shows the degree to which Iran's air defenses have been destroyed in recent days. There was a joke running around, I heard in a podcast recently, that on Persian media, they're saying something about, we understand our air defense assets were hit, but were the sirens destroyed as well? Because in a lot of these cases, the alert is not going off until after the detonation takes place, which means that Iran, in some cases, is not able to detect these incoming strikes at all. Now, we should mention the nuclear facilities here. We have a little more information on what may or may not have been destroyed. According to the BBC, they say centrifuges at Iran's underground uranium enrichment plant at Natanz were likely to have been severely damaged, if not destroyed altogether, following Israeli strikes on Friday. And this is according to the head of the global nuclear watchdog. Rafael Grossi of the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, said this was a result of power cuts caused by the attack in which an above-ground plant was completely destroyed. He said the damage was likely caused despite the underground halls housing the centrifuges not being directly hit. He says the centrifuges are fragile, finely balanced machines which spin uranium gas at extremely high speeds using rotors. A small problem, such as a temporary power cut, can send a centrifuge spinning out of control with parts smashing into each other and damaging a whole cascade. And when you look at some of the imagery from Natanz, when you zoom in a little bit here and you see some of the labeling on this overhead imagery, this was not a blanket strike. Israel did not go after everything that was above ground or just try to hit the entire facility. You'll see they specifically went after power generation, like very precise strikes on backup generators, things like that, to where it looks like, again, the IAEA from a distance, they have nobody on the ground that I'm aware of, is able to assess that those centrifuges are probably destroyed. Now, turning to the Iranian attacks, they did continue yesterday. The IDF put out a statement saying this morning and through the night, approximately 30 missiles were launched towards the state of Israel. Most of the missiles were intercepted, but several impacts were identified. And again, they stressed the Iranians still possess the capabilities and intent to strike Israel's home front. This is not over. We should expect the continuation of Iranian strikes against Israel. The number has been decreasing. Number of munitions has been steadily going down. That is probably an indication of a couple things. First and foremost, the Israelis able to identify some of these launch platforms as they're coming out from these tunnels and striking those. We talked about it in yesterday's video, but there's a bottleneck in the Iranian missile capabilities in that they have fewer launch platforms than they have missiles, and it's not even close. And at this point, Israel says they have successfully eliminated approximately 1/3 of Iran's mobile ballistic missile launchers. Those are much harder to target than stationary sites, but stationary sites can probably only get 1 or 2 launches off, but even if especially if they're hidden, before Israel identifies those locations and takes them out. So the number of mobile launchers has been steadily decreasing, and more were eliminated yesterday. Now, one note on the damage inside of Israel. I'm certain that we don't have the full extent of what has been hit quite yet. There were some pictures starting to come out yesterday showing some impacts in Haifa, but by and large, Israel has done a pretty good job of keeping photos and videos of battle damage assessments under wraps. generally the same in Iran, and I know the way that this will be interpreted is Israel censoring information or not allowing the truth to be told. This is how a country operates at war. It's the same thing that we're seeing with Ukraine and Russia for years now. To get effective battle damage assessments requires leaks or satellite imagery that is shared by a third party or something like that. We don't get the targeted country sharing exactly what or wasn't hit. There's no benefit in this case for Israel to say they tried to hit an airbase and they missed, or they did hit the airbase, but it only took one hangar out and there were no aircraft. Zero incentive to put out any of that information, and the same goes for Iran. So I would expect at this point, we are getting a lot of the battle damage assessments out of Iran from satellite imagery, and we are seeing a lot of the strikes recorded with Israeli aircraft. That's a big difference here. Missiles don't really have cameras that they can record off of, although some of the drones do. We haven't seen any of the drone footage yet. My guess, just given the quantity and the scale of the munitions so far fired at Israel, there probably has been some destruction, not necessarily casualties, but destruction to some infrastructure or key buildings that has not yet been made public that we might learn about after this conflict comes to a wrap. Again, that's just the nature of how countries operate at war. You want to keep that information as tightly held as possible. But again, as of now, it does look like the United States is kind of trending towards a war footing with Iran. Would not be surprised at all in the coming days if we see that the United States is at the very least assisting Israeli military aircraft to carry out these strikes, if not carrying out some of these airstrikes, especially on the Fordo nuclear facility ourselves. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.